Today's show is sponsored by Find Houston Senior Care, your one-stop shop for everything senior care and senior living in the greater Houston area. Visit findhoustonseniorcare.com today. And now, here's your host, Catherine Watson. Hey, everybody. Welcome again to the Life After 50 show. I'm here with a guest, Brianna Garrison, and she's going to be talking to us about, hi, Brianna. Well, she'll be talking about exploring the benefits of social connection for caregivers. Big, huge topic right now. Very important, and I can't wait to talk to her. Brianna, if you would, just tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why this subject is important to you.
Yeah, I am a licensed clinical social worker by profession. I've worked here in the Houston area for the last decade plus, primarily with people experiencing chronic progressive illness and their caregivers. My current role, I am a Master's of Social Work program director here in Houston for Baylor University. And so I teach master's level social work students who are working towards that degree. And I also lead our gerontology initiative. Currently pursuing my PhD. I'm in that last lap to get my PhD, and my focus is on gerontology. Right now, my research is really focused on caregivers of persons living with dementia. My interests kind of span older adults, living well, social connections, social networks and how those impact health and health disparities. Kind of that intersection is really important to me. And I have just always adored older adults. I had very close relationship with my grandparents, was the primary caregiver for my grandfather in his last, 7 years of life. And so this topic is just really, really important to me, and caregivers in general. I just have a deep heartbeat and connection for the work that they do.
Yeah. If you were primary caregiver for him for 7 years, you get it. You understand what the caregivers are experiencing. And though each of us have a different journey and each of us experience different things, we all have that common bond in that it is challenging. It is isolating. There are a lot of moving pieces. And so I thank you for coming on the show. And I'm amazed at all the things you're doing. I want to point out she's also a mom. So I don't know how she does it all, but I'm glad that she does, because our seniors need you and our caregivers need you. They need this information. They need this help. And so I applaud the work that you're doing. And I thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and the way that you are connecting the community. That's so important, just to have access to resources and know what's out there. And education, I feel like there's so much bad that goes along with social media, but education and connection to other people is the greatest benefit.
That's what I love about social media, and that's why I'm such a big advocate of it, because of the education and the information and the sharing and the help that we're able to give one another. So let's dive into some of these questions that we have here today. So Brianna, what exactly is social isolation, and how does it impact people living with dementia and their caregivers?
Yeah, so social isolation has really become this focus of a lot of topics when it comes to health. What we see is just in general, isolation increases almost every decade of aging. So 50, 60, 70, social networks continue to decrease. And some of that is because of loss that we experience, but a lot of that is really because of changes in our networks and how we're connected to people. And an illness separates us from individuals. Sometimes the stigma that comes along with illness separates us. And so what we see with caregivers, but especially persons living with dementia, what we see particularly is that social isolation is a huge issue. And the reason why is kind of twofold. We see pulling away as a protective mechanism, right? As signs and symptoms of the disease happen, if I am exposed less, then maybe less people will know. Also,
Right.
fear of being embarrassed or saying the wrong thing or being caught off guard. But then also on the flip side, the people in our social circles don't know what to do. And so the normal reaching out and social activities that happen begin to dwindle. But
Hmm.
this is particularly devastating for persons living with dementia because isolation can impact routine, and we know that routine and consistency is a staple in helping reduce cognitive load for those that are living with dementia. But additionally, the stimulation that comes from social interaction, using both sides of our brain, really digging into those memories, working on those social skills, and even just the emotional benefits of feeling cared for, feeling valued, a protective measure against depression. I mean, there's so many benefits that can come from social connection that isolation is just such a big deal. We see the progression of the disease increase really abundantly when social isolation
I,
occurs.
I totally agree with that. My mother-in-law was a very, very active lady. She lived away from us. She had no family in the town that she lived in, but she was very active in her community. She belonged to a lot of organizations and clubs. She played mahjong, she played bridge. And then she started backing away, and suddenly she wasn't doing these different activities. And when she dropped her mahjong, which I knew was her favorite,
Yeah.
I knew something
Mhm.
serious was going on.
Yeah.
And I think what it was she was trying to hide, like you said, the fact. And hold on a minute, looks like my computer is trying to go out. This is an interesting day.
Yes. I'm there with you.
There we go. Plug it back in. Okay, we're both having technical difficulties. Okay, got it plugged back in. So my mother-in-law is, she pulls away from the mahjong, and that's her favorite thing, one of her favorite things. And I know she was trying to hide the fact that she was having some cognitive difficulties, and she didn't want anybody to know about them. And she really hid them from her family, as a lot of times happens. She kind of confided in me. I was kind of the middle go-between. She had two sons, and she wanted them to think that mom was perfect, just like they had always known. She was the same mom. And so she would confide in me from time to time what was going on. But she began to isolate herself, and that's when she really started going downhill big time. I saw the same thing with my mother. When
Yeah.
she was no longer able to drive herself, she
Yeah.
did not want to ask anybody for help. She had a hard
Yes.
time with that. And so she stayed home
Yeah.
rather than going to exercise 3 days a week like she had been doing, rather
Yeah.
than going to different group meetings that she had been going to. And as soon as that happened, her health went plummeting. So
Yes.
it is a big, big issue. And
Yeah.
there's also social isolation for the caregivers too, a lot of times.
Yeah. I mean, maintaining sometimes in order to feel like you're maintaining dignity of the person, right? Then you'll pull away from activities.
Hmm.
Um, and then you see also caregivers become so consumed with the caregiving role that they don't feel free to go and participate in activities the way that they would. They also might feel worried about the safety of their loved one if they do leave. And so without the additional support, some of those activities that have been there right for their own health, for their own mental health, for their own enjoyment of life, are the first things that kind of, when you look at your overfull plate, those are the things that just
Hmm.
kind of go off.
Yeah.
Um, And then even just normal social networks, I've seen over the years in my clinical work, people that are really involved in their faith community. Their friends come from their faith community, their weekly interactions come from that. And when they can no longer attend, then
Mhm.
you see that network kind of disappear. Um, and it's really hard. It's really isolating. And I think, my hope is that we find better ways to be creative,
Mhm.
um, and find ways to really connect with people and affirm the dignity and worth despite whatever chronic illness may be present, right? That
Right.
our personhood is still there. The value of human interaction is so great and high that we need to do whatever we can to maintain it.
Mhm. So you mentioned faith communities.
Yeah.
How can they provide access to social engagement, especially in this time of COVID? So,
Yeah, I know. And COVID just adds this whole new barrier. As I've been interviewing caregivers, we have this typical isolation that comes from being a caregiver and a person living with dementia, and then we have that doubled on with COVID restrictions, right? And the
mhm,
fear that comes with it. And what I've heard from caregivers in the last several months of talking with caregivers is they still want to be connected, even if they don't feel safe coming to a faith community, right? And a lot of our faith communities aren't meeting in person. They're doing a lot of virtual events, which actually are benefiting caregivers. They're still able to
mhm.
participate in that way. But I
Yes.
think some of the creative ways of having ministries that are calling people or dropping things at the door,
Yeah.
figuring out, one of the ladies told me that there's a person in their church that's doing drive-by sacraments, and they're,
Oh,
in the car with all the masks on, and letting people take the sacrament still, so that they still feel connected to those sacred pieces of what faith means to them. And
mhm.
so I think for our faith communities, this is an opportunity. Every faith community right now is thinking about, how do we engage people when they can't come into our building, right? But
Mhm.
this is the primary question that needs to be asked as we're seeing older adults age, right? We have this whole generation of baby boomers that are coming and growing, and our older adult population is increasing, which means that they will also increase in our faith communities. So my hope is that we'll take all the creative energy that's happening right now in faith communities to think about connecting with members in ways that we wouldn't normally do, typical services, and really think about
Mhm.
what of those things need to stay so that they can really minister and keep connection with those that have served faithfully, right? The
Right.
the the
Right.
couples that I've talked to, I mean, the average years of service in a faith community, I think so far, my latest data analysis that I've done is like 29 years, but
Wow.
it spans from, 2, 4, 5 years to 52 years. So
Mhm.
these are people that have poured into the service and the life of a faith community, and now because of age or disease or barriers are feeling disconnected. I think we can
Yes.
take this COVID creativity, right? And really
Yes.
think about, what are we intentionally and actively doing to pursue our members who can no longer attend? So just like,
Mhm.
you mentioned your mom is pulled back from mahjong, right? Like this is the height of, okay, this is, something's going on. I think that's
Mhm.
also true of a lot of older adults when it comes to their faith communities.
Yes.
They've faithfully attended every Sunday, for 50 plus years, and they're not coming all of a sudden. That should be a clue to us that something's going on.
Absolutely. Absolutely, it should. And, it can be as simple as a phone call. A phone call can
Mhm.
make such a difference. And you
Yes.
talk about the seniors, but also paying attention to their adult children that are
Mhm.
suddenly not showing up. What's going on there? Are they caring for a parent? do they need some support? I know when I took care of my mother, and she was bedbound for about 1.5 years, almost 2 years on hospice. We kept her in the home, and my sisters and I rotated and took turns. And when I would go in usually on a Friday and stay till Monday. And I saw nobody else, just my mom. But every Saturday morning, a hospice volunteer named Charlie would call me. It was like clockwork. At 10 a.m., the phone would ring and it would be Charlie, and he wanted to know how I was doing. Brianna, I can't tell you the difference that made in that weekend, because some weekends were wonderful and they were delightful, and other weekends were dark and they were scary.
Yeah.
And it was, I was lonely and I didn't know what to do, and I could always count on that. So for the faith communities out there, I say, start a calling system, have a team that calls people regularly just to check in, so that they can kind of count on that. Like you said before, you were mentioning routine, how important that is. And they have gotten out of the routine of going to church. But if they have a routine of having that connection, that person that does the drive-by sacraments, that's so important. So yes, I agree.
Yeah, I think so too. And let those signs of pulling away be an indicator of we need to do more, not, oh no, this faithful person is no longer being faithful to our church or to their faith, right? Because it's usually a profound loss. What I hear from caregivers over and over is it just doubles on the grief, and their own guilt. A lot of people really feel connected and they feel called to do that. And when they can't, it's really hard. And so, phone calls are not that hard. And there are so many people I think, in faith communities that be willing to be volunteers in ways that are really practical. So the things that I hear the most that make caregivers feel connected in their communities are practical offers of help, bringing meals, mowing the lawn, sitting with the loved one to give them a break, and also the emotional check-ins, right? The cards, the phone calls, creating support groups, right? Really partnering with community agencies to offer services and education, acknowledging that this exists, right, in your community is really important. Yeah.
And I do a lot of work together with an organization called Care Partners. Are you familiar with them?
Yes.
So Care Partners, it partners with the churches in the Houston area, and they have done some amazing things. I am just blown away by the creativity and the different things that they're doing. But they have drive-by little events where they, they bring joy. And I think that's important. We need to bring joy as well. So they bring joy to people. They have support groups that go on online. They have really transitioned quickly to the online. It's not what we all want. We want to have that deep, one-on-one connection, but until we can, we need something else. And even when it goes back to where we can have in-person things, like you said, some people cannot do the in-person. My mother was bedbound. She couldn't do anything in person. But had there been some of the online things that we have now, it would have been amazing to add that to her day. That would have been great. So that's super. Let me ask you another question. What impact can transforming the narrative around dementia provide access to social engagement?
Yeah, this is so important to me. The disease of dementia still has such a strong stigma with it. I read this year this research that said most people fear dementia more than they fear death. And that is just gut-wrenching, right? To think of the view that we have of living with dementia is so bleak that it's really equated with so much loss.
Mhm.
And I don't want to minimize the loss. I know that individuals that live with dementia experience loss, right? Loss of abilities and loss of connection in ways that are really profound, and the same for their caregivers. But there also is this really beautiful personhood that still exists, that has strengths and
Mhm.
contribution and the ability to have connection, that I think we diminish with this narrative of loss and what's going away, right? Anytime we talk about dementia, we always talk about, what stage are we at,
Mhm.
what abilities are gone, what's gone away, and we forget that the other half of that is what still remains. And despite any of the talents and skills that still remain, the human and the person still remains, right?
Mhm.
And all the research shows that even until late stage dementia, that the ability to have connection still exists, even if it looks different than the way that we think about connection. That human connection is so important. And so I think if we continue this narrative of loss, we miss out on opportunities to really see the profound opportunities for connection, for strength, for affirming the value and dignity and personhood that a person living with dementia still possesses, right? And that
Mhm.
their caregivers still see, and the people that love them still see. And I think broadly in our communities, if we talk about that more and we use strength-based language, right, then we can see this transition of life with dementia doesn't stop as soon as the diagnosis of dementia is
Right.
there, right? It still
Right.
persists. And there are many great organizations that really
Mhm.
affirm this. Care Partners does such a great job of
Yes.
providing connection and doing that. Amazing Place is an adult day center
Mhm.
here, and they have writing programs and art programs. They really find ways to build in even new strengths, right? Some
Yes.
people that
Yes.
that may have had inhibitions preventing them from engaging in creative activities now are free to do those. Baker Ripley has great services. And so there are a lot of places doing great things. But I think broadly in our communities, we still are really suffering from the stigma that comes with dementia by the
Mhm.
language that we use, by focusing on what's gone instead of what's still presently there. And I think that mindset also is beneficial to caregivers, right? It can feel so overwhelming to see those changes and know
Mhm.
the marked difference. And I think sometimes just the reminder of there are still really great ways that you can connect. In my
Yeah.
clinical work, I would tell especially partners that have lived with their loved one for many decades, maybe your cognitive intimacy is different, but sitting and listening to music that you listened to when you first started dating, that's still going to bring up those emotions, right?
Mhm.
Holding their hand and looking at them and treating them with dignity and respect really affirms their value, right? And assuages any of those thoughts that they may have that I'm not the same, or I'm not worthy because I'm not the same person I used to be. Um, so that's
I
really what I
think
think.
exactly. And I think when families finally get to the point, and it's a process because it is a grieving. When somebody
Yeah.
has been diagnosed with dementia, you are grieving. The family is grieving, everybody's grieving. So it's a process. But once they can get to the place where they can accept what's happening, it becomes so much easier. No longer are you fighting against the person with dementia, trying to get them to mold into your world, but yet you have stepped into their world.
Mm.
And I think it makes such a difference. I know it did with myself. I know it did with my husband. We both went through it with our moms. And you just finally get to that place. I mean, I can remember the day that my husband finally stepped into her world, and we had gone to a restaurant in town, and on the way back she starts talking about what a wonderful trip to New Orleans we had. Yeah.
Oh,
And my husband started to say something, and I just gently touched his leg and looked at him, and he said, wow, it wasn't that great, Mom, and we went into the story with her, and you know what, it was kind of fun. I
yeah.
almost felt like I'd gone to New Orleans too.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
when you can step into their world. Laura Wayman was on the show recently, and she talked about dementia awareness, and
Mm,
she's on a mission to help the world become more aware and
mm,
understand and relate to people with dementia.
yeah.
So, we are running low on time. You're just such a fascinating person to talk to. You've got so
Thank you.
much information, but one more question. What
Okay.
is social connectedness, and how does it
Mm,
impact the caregivers of the persons living with dementia?
yeah. So this social connectedness is really this kind of twofold. It's tangibly having a network that that you can rely on, that is still active and participating in your life in ways that you can tangibly mark. But it's also the feeling and perception of the caregiver that they are known, that their experience is validated, that the good and the bad that goes along with what they're doing is acknowledged. And it really is this byproduct of intentional efforts from friends, from um, community organizations that are really doing great work to make sure that caregivers feel heard, that they feel taken care of, that they're given the tools that they need to do the job that they're doing, right? Because this is not
Mhm,
a trained job that most caregivers went to school to do, right? You're just kind of
mhm,
thrust into all the roles that you're doing. And it's also this opportunity to really participate in the life, right? So
mhm,
if that's in a faith community, that means that they're finding creative ways to keep them participating in the faith community's life and offerings, and the basic tenets of what that person perceives as being part of that faith community. In your social networks, that means that you are being checked in on, and there's this mutuality in the relationship, right? They're seeing how you're doing. Like, I love that you said the hospice called you every Saturday at 10
mhm,
a.m., right? The more predictability that you can have of
mhm.
when you have those hard weeks, Charlie's going to call Saturday
That's
at
right.
10.
Oh,
I
makes all the
have a
difference.
Yes, I have a place where
Mhm,
this energy and these feelings that I'm feeling, that I can have it at, right?
mhm,
And what that does is it reduces the burden that caregivers experience. It increases life, like actual years of life. It reduces comorbidities with other health. I mean,
mhm.
the impacts, I mean, we could just talk all day long about
I
how important
know.
it is. And so when you think about, um, oh, it just feels like such a small thing to routinely call someone, or to write someone a letter, or to drop by a meal. But those things genuinely have multifaceted impacts on caregivers. Um, and so my encouragement to our community is just to think about who are those people in your life that are around you. Know your community, know the people that are around. And if you have a friend that all of a sudden can't do the fun lunches and things that you had planned, what are ways that you can really intentionally maintain connection with them?
Mhm,
And the stories that I hear from caregivers like yours of Charlie calling,
mhm.
they are so memorable, of those small acts of connection, because they're lifelines.
Absolutely, absolutely they are. They really
Yeah,
are.
yeah.
Brianna, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for being here. You have a
Mhm.
survey that you're doing. Tell us a little bit about that, and I'm going to put up the survey link but it's kind of long. So everybody, I will also put it in the show notes. If
Okay.
you're listening to this on the podcast, it'll be in the show notes. If you're watching it on YouTube or Facebook, it'll also be in the show notes. Okay. So in the comments below and in the top.
Perfect.
All right.
So this survey is part of my dissertation research. I'm really looking at how are caregivers living? What's their experience with connection and isolation, with faith communities, and what makes them feel cared for, what makes them feel isolated. And my big hope is that we can take tangible information from this research and say, this is what we need to go and do for training. These are programs that we need to implement. These are places that we need to look at advocating for public funding. I really want to tangibly take the lived experience that caregivers have and say, this is how we can do better in our communities to make sure our caregivers really feel connected and they don't feel so alone.
Great. Well, that sounds like a really important survey to take. I'll make sure I take it and I'll pass it along to all the caregiver groups that I belong to. I'll make sure that we get that out there. Very important. If you want to connect with Brianna, we have her email address up on the screen. If you're watching this on a podcast later, or listening rather on a podcast, it'll be in the show notes. But it's Brianna_Garrison1@Baylor.edu.
Yes.
Again, Brianna, I can't thank you enough for being on the show today. We were exploring the benefits of social connection for caregivers. So if for some reason you just tuned in, it's okay. You can watch the replay. That's the beauty of the internet. You can watch that replay, right?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Brianna. And I'm sure we'll have you back on the show. I could talk to you for hours. There's no doubt about that. We could chat for hours about so many different things, and you are a wealth of information. So go take care of your kiddo. I know you've got a sick child at home today. So go take care of your kiddo and enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks for all that you do for our seniors and our caregivers.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
All right. Welcome to the Life After 50 show, helping you navigate the second half of your life. Today's show is sponsored by Find Houston Senior Care, your one-stop shop for everything senior care and senior living in the greater